All right, hello. In this video, we're going to talk about CSS's box model, which is basically the way that we're going to be able to specify things like spacing and positioning and sort of in some way sense the sizing of different elements and different parts of content on my page. So again, in this video, what we're going to talk about is we'll go through the box model itself, talk about how we sort of measure and understand that. We'll then talk about a little bit about just changing display types, and we'll also then talk a little bit about positioning at the very end, just to kind of mention it, even though we don't really want to do much positioning changes using these methods. Okay, so in an HTML element, all elements, right, all sets of content on a web page take up a particular amount of space on that page based on their box sizing. And so you can see this in the developer tools on a web page, right? So if I try to look at my different different elements of my developer tools, right, you can see that like here's my header, and you can see this blue box that indicates sort of where that header takes up space on my page, right? And you can see that blue box is that's the content of my header. Inside of that, you can see this H1, and we'll talk about the orange lines in a second, right? My main here takes up that much of the page, and inside of that, my section takes up that much of the page. And then my div, right, here's my first div taking up some parts of the page, and my second div taking up some other parts of the page. So each element takes up a box, a sort of square rectangle space on the page. Even if you try to start rounding out corners or using circles or other things, all elements take up a box of content on the page. And this is what's then known as the box model. Now, the reason we then talk about this box model is we can then adjust how much space things take up on the page by adjusting the properties of this box model. And there's sort of three different ways that we can be able to specify how big of a space these things take up. And we can do that by modifying the padding, the border, and the margin. All right, and we'll work through each of these sort of one at a time. So I'm going to start by taking my paragraphs, and I'm going to add them a border, and we'll talk about this in a second, but I want to just be able to use the CSS to draw a hold on. Sorry. Black. There we go. To draw a box around my paragraph. So now you can actually see like where are the boxes that these things are taking up. Again, if I was like using the developer tools to mouse over this, my section, right, you can see, oh my gosh, here's my first paragraph. Here's my second paragraph, right? You can see that they're taking up those boxes of space. Now, you can think of that box as like literally a box around it. I often think about placing the content as like inside of like a cardboard box. And we say, great, if I have this much content, it needs to go inside a box. It's going to fill up as much if I want to like, ship it to somebody else or set it as a package or something. And that's what my border sort of ends up where those lines of the box are. Now, we can put spacing between the content and the border of the box by specifying what is called the padding. So the padding is going to indicate how much space goes between the content, think the text, and the edge of my box, right? This border of the area. This is similar to how you might think of adding padding, like again, if you're shipping a package, right? You've got your special lamp you're sending to somebody in a box. You're going to put a bunch of like packing peanuts or styrofoam or some kind of paper, right, to pad it so it doesn't bounce around against the edge of the box. So padding adds that extra space. We specify padding by using a padding property. So I can add a certain amount of padding to my space. So for example, I could add 1 EM's worth of padding, and which you may recall from the previous video, where 1 EM is approximately 16 pixels, but again, it scales based on our sort of font size. So if I say I want this to be 1 EM of padding, that adds 1 EM's worth of padding, right, 16 pixels, sort of around my content, right, between the content and the edge of the box itself. If I use Chrome's developer tools, right, to look at this paragraph, you can see, and I can't really point to it with the mouse, so you just have to sort of look at it. But you can see that now the content itself, right, is in that blue box, right? That's sort of the area that's the size of my lamp, right? That's where my content, my text is. Now, because it's a block element, the text goes to the edge of the screen, more or less, even though the text doesn't actually go that far. And then my padding is this green box around it, right? The green box there indicates that's my padding, right? That's my styrofoam, my bubble wrap around the content itself. So if I say padding, 1 EM, that's going to add 1 EM of padding on all 4 sides. I can also specify individual sides if I want, right? I could say, let's put some padding on the top for 1 EM, and that puts padding then just along the top of my box. I could also say put padding on the bottom of my box. I could say put padding on the left 2 ems for fun, and padding on the right, 2 ems, right? So I can also specify individual amounts of padding on different sides of my box. Technically, if I just put padding, like 1 em, right? This rule here is technically what's called a shortcut property, where really this, when I just say padding without specifying sizing, that's really just writing out these 4 properties, but as a shortcut, doing them all at once, right? So instead of actually saying, write out these 4 things individually, I can say, let's use the single property. They'll say add in, just like apply 1 EMs to everything, right? It's a shorthand instead of having to do anything else. It is actually possible with padding to indicate that I want to specify all 4 sizes in the same thing, in the same property, just by adding a different space here. So if I do 1 EM, 2 EM, 3 EM, 4 EM, you can see this gives me 1 EM on the top, 2 EMs on the bottom, no, on the left, 3 on the bottom, and 4 on the right. Sorry, top, right, bottom, left. It's easier to see on this one, right? Because then you can see it against the end. Top, right, bottom, left. So I can basically specify all 4 properties inside of a single sort of shortcut. If you only specify 2 numbers, right? If I do 1 EM and 3 EM, then the 1 EM is top and bottom, and the 3 EM is left and right. So you basically, there's lots of different ways, depending on how many numbers you specify for your padding, which siding is going to apply to. I'm not going to lie, I forget all the time. I don't remember like which numbers are which. So what I will often do is that I'll either say like add the same amount of padding all around, or if I want to not be all around, I'll just use the 4 rules, right? Top, bottom, left, and right. If I say I want top and bottom and left and right to be sort of like 2 different things, I maybe use the double rule. So if I'm like, okay, I want to have 2 EMs of padding on top and bottom, but 1 EM of padding on the sides, right? I can write it out that way. And then if it doesn't do what I want, where I'm like, it actually did, you know, for example, if I wanted 2 EM on the padding, if I would say I want 1 on the top and bottom, 2 on the sides, or sorry, then like it gets me that effect. If I realize I got it backwards, I just swap them. All right. Cool. Now it's giving me the effect I want. So often it'll be a little bit trial and error to sort of figure out the exact layout you want. And that's okay because it's programming and we're allowed to like adjust and tweak things as we go. Okay, so again, that's padding with a shortcut property in order to specify these. All right. And again, to notice the padding here is, right, we got our blue space as the content, and the padding is the space then between the content and the edge of my cardboard box. All right, back to our box model. Outside the padding, we then have what's called the border. The border itself is, I think of it as the cardboard box itself around the edge. So this is this black line that you can see. Now, when I specify border, there's actually 3 parts to my border. The first is going to be the thickness of my border. Think of this as like when you're making a cardboard box, how thick of the cardboard are you being? Is it 1 pixel thick or is it 5 pixels thick? Right? There's a 5 pixel thick border. You then have the style of the border, right? Is it solid cardboard or is it like cardboard that has like punctuations or holes in it? And there's a couple of options here. You could do like a dotted border. You could do a dashed border. Right, you could add some different styling to borders. In practice, these aren't really common. Generally, people are going to do solid borders just because that's how most visual design tends to work. And then finally, you specify the color, right? So in this case, I've currently said I want my borders to be black, but of course, I could make them Rebecca purple, and now I have purple borders. I could make them be cyan, right? And now I have cyan borders. So again, you can specify the colors of those borders. Borders, again, can be specified top, bottom, left, and right, just like we did with padding. So, for example, I could say instead of including a border all the way around, I might say I want a border to be 5 pixels solid cyan, but I want it to only be on the bottom. So I have like a bottom border. A bottom border. Right now, I was writing only a border on the bottom of my element. Now, it looks like I've added lines between these things, but really all I've done is I've said take my box and make my border, which you can kind of see is this kind of like this kind of slightly different colored gray line. Well, actually, that's just the cyan line. You can see that sort of adding a space between things. So often what people do if they want to add like lines, like just like block lines between content in some ways, you don't actually do that in HTML because it's just a visual appearance thing. So you actually will do it using borders, generally on the bottom borders from your CSS. Similarly, if I want border on the bottom, but I want a border on the left to be 5 pixels solid red. This is going to look horrifying. I apologize. Nope, forgot what's there. There we go. Right, I can add bordering sort of along one side as well if I wanted to. Great. So great. We can specify, and again, we can just do a lot of sort of the bottom border structuring the same way we do with padding. Technically, and no one ever does this, but it is possible to talk about the border style, the border color, the border style, and the border width as 3 distinct rules. And technically, you can even do border color bottom as its own distinct rule. All right, let's make this yellow. Border color, sorry, border bottom color. Gotta get the ordering right. Right, and I can specify then the color of the border on the bottom. So you can actually write out in more detail if you want to specify just one piece of just one border of the element. So technically, this border rule, right, that has these 3 things is actually a shortcut, sort of shortcut element property for 12 different options, right? 3 things for each of the different sides. All right. So in any case, there's our border, right? I'm going to add in our full border here so we can see what it looks like. We're good to go. All right, there's our border for going all the way around the box. All right. Outside the border then, so again, think of the border as like the cardboard. Like how thick is the cardboard between your box, around your box? So padding is the sort of the filling, right? The packing peanuts, the bubble wrap between your content, your lamp or whatever, and the edge of your box. The border is going to like be how thick your border actually is, right? Your box of cardboard is actually going to be. Outside the border, you then have what's called the margin. And the margin is the space between different boxes. So if I have a lot of different boxes, I'm trying to like fill up a moving truck or a UPS truck or some kind. The margin isn't indicating how much space between my lamp and the edge of its cardboard. The margin says how much space needs to go between each cardboard box. Are the cardboard boxes like right up next to each other touching, or there's some space between my cardboard boxes? In Visual Studio, the elements you can see the margin is this orange space between my elements. So you see how that I've got my blue in the middle, that's my content, right? My lamp. I've got my light. Actually, here, let me make my border black because that'll make it easier to see. There we go. Right, I've got my we've got the border, which you can see is kind of a brownish area, and then I've got this margin, which is this orange space around the edge of that. Paragraphs by default contain some margin, right? That's why it's so even without me doing any styling, right? The browser sort of automatically provides some margin for my paragraph. But I can specify the margin I want, right? I can say I want margin to be 1 EM's worth of margin. And now you can see around my paragraph, I have 1 EM's worth of spacing between between my paragraph and the next paragraph down, right? There's one paragraph that's got 1 EM of spacing between these 2 things. Again, we can specify these things different, right? I could say that I want to have margin on the bottom of 2 EMs, and then now adds 2 EMs of margin on the bottom while not changing any of the margins on the sides. So again, it works the same way as padding, where I can specify what sides I want this to be. Now, the thing to note, one of the distinctions between margin and padding, in terms of how these work, is that you'll notice that in my padding area here, right, I've got this gray area between my top and bottom, right, of all my elements. And even though this paragraph has 1 EMs of padding below it, right, you'll see that, notice the space below and the space at the side are the same, right? They're both 1 EMs. This paragraph also has, this paragraph also has 1 EM of padding above and to the side. Yet the space between my 2 boxes here isn't 2 EMs. It's not that I get 1 EM of margin from the top guy and 1 EM of margin from the bottom guy, putting them 2 units away. There's still only 1 EM of spacing between them. So a margin isn't actually like packing peanuts that takes up some space. A margin is more of, think of like we talk about like with my small child, like bubble space, right? When specifying a box has a certain margin, it's saying that, hey, all you other boxes, you need to stay at least 1 EM away from me. That's my comfortable space. Now, if I say you have to stay 1 EM space away from me, and the guy next to me says you need to be 1 EM space away from me, then we can be within 1 EMs of each other, right? We're still within that arm's reach of each other. We don't need to be 2 EMs away because that puts 2 EMs of space between us. So margins, they collapse. So if an element says I want to have this much margin on the bottom, and someone else says I need to have some margin on the top, those two things can potentially overlap, right? Think of them not in saying add this much spacing as much as saying put at least this much distance between my two elements. All right, so again, with our box model, we've got our content surrounded by its padding, surrounded by the border, the edge of my box, and then I have margin that specifies how much space I need to be between those boxes. Now, here's the trick. Let me put 2em0. Let me do it that way. Oh, sorry, I forgot my colon. Okay, if you want something to have no padding or no margin, the value to use is a 0. We don't say 0 pixels because you don't actually need a unit for 0, because 0 pixels and 0 EMs and 0% and 0 REMs, they're all exactly the same. So if we want to main 0, we just say 0 with no units. So I'm gonna get rid of my padding on my margin on my padding on the side, and I can then talk about just my margin sort of along top and bottom. I'll do actually the same thing margin here, so we're gonna get rid of my margins on the side. Now, if I get rid of my border, we now can't see the border, but this paragraph has 2 EMs of padding on the bottom, there's 1 EM of margin between them, and there's 2 EMs of padding along this way. If I standardize this a little bit, that's going to help, right? I've now got, again, this 1 EM of margin, 1 EM of padding, 1 EM of margin, and 1 EM of padding. And there's that much white space between these two things, right? I've now added some blank space. Great, I didn't need to add extra blank paragraphs. I just added some padding and margin to increase the spacing between them. So again, if we count this up, right, my paragraph has 1 EM of padding, 1 EM of margin. This paragraph then has the 1 EM of margin and then 1 EM padding. So that's 3 EMs of space between these two paragraphs. If I shift it so that they have 0 padding, but 3 EMs of margin, that's still going to be 3 EMs of space. And you'll notice that the space between these paragraphs looks exactly the same. It looks identical. So the difference between having 3 EMs of margin and 0 padding versus having 1 EM of padding and 1 EM of margin is exactly the same in this. I mean, it's impacting the difference between this paragraph and the H1, but it's having no impact on sort of the visible white space of between my elements here. Similarly, if I said have 0 margin and 1.5 EMs of padding, no actual visual effect, right? It's not changing what I'm seeing. I'm still looking like this amount of white space between them. So often when people are thinking about margin and padding, you're often like, there's a question about, well, which do I want to use? If I want to add some white space between my elements, am I trying to add some margin or am I trying to add some padding? And as you notice, depending on which you use and how much you use, you might get the same effect. It may actually not matter. You might get the same appearance no matter if you use margin or if you use padding. But there are differences between them, right? Remember that they're reading at different parts of my boxes. So while saying the difference between doing 1 EM of padding, 0 padding, and 3 EMs of margin, right? Well, that creates no difference in this effect. If I put my border back in here, let's put a nice little thin border, right? 0 padding and lots of margin is very, very different from having some padding and 0 margin, right? That changes where my borders show up. Similarly, if you try to specify something like a background color, and I'm going to use a light gray. Oh, here, let me put the color back so you can see it for a second. The background color fills the box. If I say I want this element to have this background, that's going to fill up my box, right, between the edges of my cardboard, which means my padding, my packing peanuts are also going to get colored based on that background color. So if I then say have a background color of light gray, now the distinction between having my lots of padding, 1.5 EMs of padding on all my elements, versus having 0 padding and 3 margin, now it has a really different effect. So particularly when you have things like background color, the distinction between margin and padding does actually matter. So then the question is, when do you use which, right? When do I choose margin and when do I choose padding? This is really kind of an open question. It depends on what you're styling and what you're trying to achieve. If you have a background color, that might make it very obvious about whether you want to have padding or if you want more background color or less background color. For me, I often try to think about whether I want this element, this box, to be a bigger box, right? Because I want to take up more space on the page, or whether I want it to be further away from the stuff around it. And I know that might seem subtle, right? Because you might be like, well, I don't really care if I want the box to be bigger or if I just want to be further away. But that's really the logic, that's the difference, and that's kind of what you have to begin thinking about. So what I might try to think is like, okay, do I want this original section to be bigger, right? Do I want to have take up a bigger amount of space on my page with the potential to then have it like actually, potentially grow or potentially shove other things around the side? Do I want to actually be bigger? If I want that element to be larger, take up more space, I'm going to increase its padding and use that to make the element bigger. I'm not just going to change the width and the height of the element because that produces a slightly different effect, but I might say I'm going to use some padding to say I want it to take up more space, right? I want its edge, where its background might show up, I want that to be pushed farther out. That's my padding. If I instead say I want my elements to have some more space between them, or I want other stuff to be further away, I'm going to use things like margin. Margin will let me push out other content around it. So again, it's kind of this subtle distinction between, am I trying to make the element bigger, take up more space on the page, or am I trying to just make sure other things are further away from it? That's really the decision that needs to be made. And again, it depends on what how you sort of are thinking about the design of your page and how you're trying to think about doing some layout and making these things come together. For me personally, when in doubt, if I don't know what I'm trying to do, I haven't made that decision, I default to using padding. When in doubt, I'm like, hey, I want this to have some space around it. I'm going to think about using padding to make my box bigger, right? So my default would be say, let's give it more padding and less margin, right? By giving it more padding, I'm making sure that my background, black, like I'm making sure that I'm saying that I want this thing to have some space around it. I'm actually saying like that space should be part of the box, right? That needs to be filled up by something. I'm not a big fan of sort of leaving space between those boxes because then it's like, well, what's going to go in that space? Again, because margins do some collapsing work, it often can get a little bit more confusing understanding like how these things interact. Versus padding says, make the box bigger. And if the box is bigger, I know how big that box is going to be, and that lets me be able to adjust it a little bit. So I will often default to using padding to add space between elements, right, by just making the boxes bigger. Or I'll use margin if I really want to think about I want like sections or parts of my page to be further apart. So very much I might think, okay, I want these boxes to be bigger, but I want there to be some space between these borders. Right? I want there to like the paragraphs to have a little bit of like a sort of a line break between them. Then I might say, well, let's add a little bit of margin between those elements so that I can get sort of this spacing between my boxes. And that tends to produce a kind of nice effect. That's how I begin thinking through these kinds of. Okay, we talked about block and inline elements already. Right, so again, the block, all these stuff we've talked about with page sizing and margin and padding and stuff, that all applies to our block elements, right? Blocking elements fill up the page. Inline elements can also have margin and padding. It works a little bit differently. So we can, well, doesn't work. So let's go ahead and let's make dollar here. Emphasize it, and I'll be our styling. How about dollar sit? And there we go. So there, I've got my inline element here. There's my inline element. So I can go ahead and style my inline elements. And again, I can give these things a background color. I'll make it obvious. How about cyan? I'll make it really obvious to see. And again, I can add some padding around this thing. So again, I can add padding around inline elements and it works out exactly the same way. But again, this is where margin doesn't really make sense. Necessarily, I might say I want this inline element to be bigger versus saying I want the stuff around it to be further away. So this can happen as well, right? And you'll notice that things like if I have a list here, right, my list items, where am I? Oh my gosh, there's my list items, right? These are all block elements. They're filling out the body of the page. Now, right, that's how our inline elements goes. Now, technically, what I can do is I can actually change how those elements are being displayed. I can adjust whether something is an inline or a block element by using CSS. So if I have my list items here, right, that are all these, oh my God, stop. Right, there are all these block elements. If I don't want them to be block elements, I don't want them to fill out the length of the width of that page, I can change them by using what's called the display property. So I say, let's take my li items, and instead of making them be their normal display of block, I can say, let's change their display to make them display as inline boxes. So don't make them block boxes, make them inline boxes. And when I do that, you'll notice that now they're all inline elements. They're not taking up the full width of the page, right? So they're not stacking top and bottom. They're now standing in line with each other. They're all next to each other because they're now inline elements. And similarly, as a side effect, if you make list items inline, it also gets rid of the dot. So it gets rid of the sort of the bullet point next to them, or gets rid of the numbering for ordered lists, which lets me be able to now have an inline list, which means I can have a list of content that's like written out in a single paragraph. It's like written out like they're just like a paragraph of content, right? They're all just text next to each other. What this lets me do is this lets me use the semantic HTML for saying this thing is a list, right? There are these different items, and you want to consider them all differently and potentially style them differently, but I can still write them out as a paragraph of text, right? I don't need to actually have it be a bulleted list. I can make it an inline list along the way. This becomes really useful for things like navigation bars or sort of like nav bars at the top of your page, where you can have not just like links as paragraphs all next to each other, but you can have a list of links that are all displayed inline, so they all go top to bottom. Now, the trick here is I might say, okay, great. I want to have my 3 things. If I'm trying to make this like a nav bar type thing, I can make them display inline. That's fine. I could add some margin, right? Maybe margin on the left. I can add like 2 ems of margin, and that can put some space between them, and that's okay. Except that, again, if I want to now give them a background color, how about let's give them a, let's make, how about light pink? Sure. Right. Oh, okay, wait, no, that didn't quite work. I need them to have some padding instead. Right, padding 1 em. There, now they're a little bit bigger. But like, if I want to, for example, do something like, if I want to sort of make sure that they're all, you know what? So you'll notice that all my little boxes here are all like different sizes. If I want them to all be the same size, you might think like, okay, well, let's make them all the same width. Like, let's give these things a fixed width, make them always let's make them all 33, or let's make them all 25% of the parent. So that way they'll each take up 1/4 of my page width, and then I can have room for 4 of them if I need to. If I do that, you'll notice that actually there's no actual effect, like nothing changed. If I go to my list item here, you'll notice that this width thing is actually grayed out. It doesn't work. The reason that is because inline elements, you cannot specify the width or the height, which means you can't specify, if I want to make this box here, even though I've said be inline, now that it's inline, I can't say how wide I want it to be. Inline elements always are only big enough to fill their content, plus any padding along the edges. There is a workaround for this. If I do want to give a width or a height to an inline element, there's actually another display property value you can give it called inline block, which is basically saying make it an inline element, but lets you be able to specify the width and the height at the same time. So if I make this thing be an inline block element, now I can make them be links that they have where they all take up sort of an equal amount of space, right? They're taking up 1/4 of my page. Or, and they're trying to, and then they'll wrap the text around as it goes. Now, of course, you're like looking at me saying, hey, that's weird. Why are they taking up, you said 1/4 of the page, right, be 25%, yet it looks like each one's taking up more. I'm only able to fit 3. I don't have enough room for another box along the side here. So part of the reason that's happening is because when I specify the width as 100%, that's specifying for 1/4 of the page, that's specifying the width of my content box. Like you see my area here, my blue area, that blue area is 1/4 of the page. But my padding isn't actually being counted as part of that 25%. That's a weird sort of artifact of the way that browsers calculate sizes, is that by default, when you specify the width of an element, it doesn't actually include the padding or the border, right? That aren't considered part of the size of the element. Width is saying, here's the size of my content, and then the padding is added to that. It goes around that sort of along the way. So I don't know if I have a slide about this. Oh, I don't have a slide about this. But I'll mention it anyway because it's useful. So what we'll often end up doing instead, what we want to do to fix that problem is we're often going to specify another property called border box. And border box is a way of saying, how do we want to measure the width and the size? How do we want to specify the sizing of this? Sorry, not border box. Box sizing is the name of the property. Border box is the content we give it. So basically saying, when I figure out the size of this box, do I want to say width is the size, make the content be this width, and then add padding along the edge? Or do I want to say, let's have the width include the padding and include the border at the same time? So when I say 25%, should that be the content and its padding, or is that measuring just the content? And if I use border box, it makes it this slightly more intuitive model of saying, let's have the size of the box be literally the size of the box, not the size of the content, but the size of the box, of the cardboard itself. When I do that, you'll now notice that these things take up what looks more like a quarter of the page. So I've got enough room, sort of plus and minus, to be able to add these two sort of pieces and elements together. So box sizing is a thing that we tend to use whenever we start getting into sizing things, because it tends to make it easier to read, right? You don't have to try to think about, well, here's the size of the width, and then here's the size of the padding to figure out how big my box is. You can just say, width is the size of my box, and you don't really care how much padding or text content is inside of it. Because we want this border box sizing to apply to everything, what we'll often do is we'll often write as our very first rule on the page, we're going to use another special selector. That's a star, and the star means it's like a wild card. It means apply to every element on the page. So no matter what, every single element on the page should have a box sizing of border box. And what you'll do is you'll notice that now applies to my li elements and actually fixes and applies to my other elements as well, but we're not seeing any sort of problems at all. So using something like box sizing, border box will then, again, make it so that when you specify your widths and your sizing, it sort of matches out and measures in a more effective way. Okay. And that's the basics of the box model, right? So again, when we say the box model, really what we're meaning is this idea that we can specify spacing, the sizing of my boxes by using the padding, specify space between them using margin, borders is just sort of how thick the cardboard is, and we can specify then whether things are inline or block elements and use that to specify sort of our width and how big we want these elements to be. Okay. The one last piece I want to mention in terms of positioning and sizing and how big things are is that it is possible to block elements normally sort of sit top to bottom, right? Here's the first block, then the next block, then the next block. Inline elements sort of go next to each other in line. It is possible to adjust that. So to not have block elements sit right on top of each other and not have inline elements be next to each other, but to actually adjust where they are from their sort of where the browser would normally put those things together. And we do that by using what is called a position property. So for example, let me go ahead and let me add I'm gonna add a class to this one. We're gonna make this one the first link, so I can customize just that first link. I can take my first link here, right? So this element class first, and I can give it a position, what's called relative, which I basically say is I want to move where that element is relative to its normal position. So let's take where the browser wants to put it, right? Based on, again, its margin, based on the fact that it's an inline element, based on sort of like where it would fall in the sort of the normal layout and flow of the page that the browser's providing to us. And I can say, let's tweak that, right? I don't want it to be in this position. I want it to be slightly up or slightly to the side. So if I want to go slightly up, I can say I would like to modify this thing's position by having its top be actually 10 pixels over. Oh, and I'll actually say move the top. In this case, it says move the top 10 pixels down, right? Let's like go 10 pixels. Let's have it be 10 pixels from the top of the page. If I do a negative number, I can say go in the other direction. What that does, that will then shift it up a little bit. Similarly, I could say, let me use a right spacing. And if I want to shift it over to the right a little bit, I might say, let's do a negative 10 pixels from the right. And that then sort of shifts it 10 pixels over that way. Now, of course, saying going 10 pixels, negative 10 to the right is the same as saying go 10 pixels from the left. So I could alternatively have said do 10 pixels from the left. That gives me the exact same effect. I never need to specify both top and the bottom or both left and right. I could just specify like one direction on where I want these things to go. So again, this is used for like tweaking location of where something is, right? Move it a little bit off to the side, right? These are like how you create offsets, right? Have it go just slightly off from its sort of normal layout. There are more complex ways of doing position. There technically is an absolute position, which you should never use, but I'll show you what it looks like, right? Where I might say be absolute position, not from where you would normally be, but from where the page happens to get laid out. So I might say be 10 pixels from the top of the page and 10 pixels from the left of the page. And there it is, right? It gets thrown, like, now it's not even like in part of its normal location. Now it's like thrown out. It says, ignore where everything else happens to be. I'm going to be 10 pixels from the top and 10 pixels from the bottom, and everybody else gets sort of ignored. It pulls it out of that normal flow. That looks horrible. This is part of why we never use absolute positioning. It's really considered very bad practice for doing any kind of layout or any kind of design. Even relative positioning is considered pretty much kind of faux pas. It doesn't really achieve the effects that you want, right? It makes things look a little bit off center, but again, now you're not having elements sort of sit next to each other, right? Your boxes are now overlapping, which generally you don't want to do. The best strategy when trying to deal with positioning for the browser is to let the browser do its work. Don't try to get in its way. And if you try to specify things like position, you're trying to sort of like, you're basically trying to tell the browser that you know better than what it does for how things should be laid out. And maybe you do because you're human and the browser's a stupid computer. But in practice, if you try to say, make this thing should be shifted off the slide or be in this absolute position, that might work well on your screen, on your computer, your laptop, but it's not going to work well on somebody else's laptop that has a slightly different resolution, or someone who's got their browser taking up a slightly different amount of space, or on someone who's viewing the page on their phone or viewing it on a slightly different phone than your phone. Is that once you try to be sort of add more and more like control to what the browser is doing, it tends to make pages more fragile. They're less likely to work across different browsers, different windows, different devices. So really, we want to let the browser do its work. Let the browser lay things out the way we want, right? If I want elements to be in line, I can say be in line, and I'll let the browser put them in a row. If I want elements to be top and bottom, I might say make these things into block elements, and the browser will lay them out top to bottom. So we really don't ever want to use position. Like, it does exist, and it can be occasionally useful. There's some neat tricks you can do with it. But in practice, it's not good practice, and I would strongly recommend not doing it. If you find yourself using position, that means you're probably making your page more complicated than you expect. If you find that someone else used position to lay something out, they're probably making it so that their page is going to be incredibly hard to modify, so you're not going to be able to change anything without having the whole thing explode, and it means it's actually not going to work well across lots of different devices. So don't use position if you can avoid it, right? We really want to limit the use of positioning. Similarly, there's another property called float that makes things sort of float off to the side. We don't want to use that as well. If you're trying to specify layouts and you want things to be side by side, we're going to use the fact that they're block elements and inline elements and let the browser then lay them out side by side. We can use styles like width and padding to be able to sort of do that adjustment. Furthermore, in a future video, we'll talk about using what's called a flex box, which is another way of getting things to lay out side by side in a really effective and flexible way that'll work across lots of different browsers and lots of different device sizes without having to worry about being like, well, this guy's 10 pixels over and that from that where that element wanted to be. So again, I want to mention position because it does show up in assignments and is a useful thing to be aware of. And in particular, this idea that you have to like specify a positioning and specify then where it is relative to the top and bottom, or the top and left or the bottom and right, or top right, like some combination of the vertical and the horizontal. But again, you really want to avoid using any kind of position. Relative, maybe okay. Static or fixed, maybe okay. Absolute, never use. And then don't use float again, because there are better approaches to CSS to doing these kinds of things. And if you see this, it's probably because it's older CSS when there are less useful ways of doing it. And it's good practice to then replace that and fix that with ways that are going to be more flexible across different browsers. Okay.